In the grand and treacherous theater of medieval English politics, proximity to the throne was a double-edged sword, capable of elevating a man to heavenly heights or casting him into the most profound abyss of hell. Few understood this perilous truth better than Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man whose ambition was as sharp as the executioner's axe that would one day claim him. His story is not merely a political chronicle, but a visceral human drama of power, intimacy, and the savage retribution that follows when the love of a king becomes the hatred of a kingdom. To comprehend the depths of this hatred, which culminated in one of the most gruesome public executions in English history, we must first return to a time when a young, ambitious courtier learned that the heart of a monarch was the most valuable and volatile territory he could ever hope to conquer. Hugh Despenser the Younger was born around the year 1287 into a world of shifting allegiances and simmering baronial discontent. He was the son of Hugh Despenser the Elder, a nobleman of significant standing and a loyal servant to the formidable King Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots. The Despensers were not among the great, ancient houses of the aristocracy, those who could trace their lineage to the Norman conquest and commanded vast, independent power. Instead, they belonged to a class of service gentry, men whose fortunes were built not on ancestral right but on unwavering loyalty and administrative competence to the crown. From his father, Hugh learned a crucial lesson. True power flowed from the king, and to serve the king faithfully was the surest path to wealth and influence. He grew up in the shadow of a powerful monarchy, internalizing the belief that royal favor was the ultimate currency. From a tender age, it was clear that Hugh was no ordinary nobleman's son. He possessed a voracious intellect and a restless ambition that far outstripped his station. He was keenly observant, quick-witted, and had a natural talent for navigating the intricate and often deadly currents of court life. These qualities did not go unnoticed, and they were destined to attract the gaze of the powerful, setting him on a trajectory that would alter the course of the English monarchy. His first major step towards this destiny came not on the battlefield or in the council chamber, but at the altar. On the 26th of May, 1306, Hugh's life was irrevocably transformed when he was married to Eleanor de Clare. This was no simple match. It was a strategic masterstroke orchestrated by King Edward I himself. Eleanor was the king's own granddaughter, making her the niece of the heir to the throne, the future Edward II. The king paid Hugh's father a staggering £2,000 for the privilege of the union, a clear signal of the value he placed on binding the capable Despenser family even more tightly to the royal house. This marriage instantly propelled Hugh into the inner sanctum of the royal family. He was no longer just a well-connected courtier. He was now kin to the king, a relationship that would become the bedrock of his future power and the catalyst for his ultimate doom. For a time, Hugh's career seemed set on a conventional path. He was a provincial nobleman with respectable, though modest, landholdings, serving periodically at court but giving little indication of the extraordinary power he would one day command. However, fate, in its often cruel way, had a dramatic turn in store. The year 1314 brought with it the disastrous Battle of Bannockburn, a crushing defeat for the English at the hands of the Scots. Among the English dead was a very important man, Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester and Eleanor's brother. His death on the battlefield was a national tragedy, but for Hugh Despenser, it was a golden opportunity. Overnight, Gilbert's death transformed his sister Eleanor into one of the three heiresses to the immense Gloucester fortune, one of the wealthiest earldoms in all of England. Suddenly, through his wife, Hugh became the Lord of Glamorgan and a magnate of the First Order. He was no longer a man of modest means but one of England's richest individuals. This sudden infusion of wealth provided him with more than just economic security. It gave him a vast territorial base, particularly in the Welsh Marches, and the political muscle required to exert devastating influence on the national stage. It was during this period of newfound prominence that he began to cultivate a much closer, more intimate relationship with the new king, Edward II. King Edward II was a monarch unlike his father. Where Edward I was a stern warrior, Edward II was an aesthete, known for his unconventional tastes and, most scandalously, his deep emotional attachments to male favorites. His first and most infamous companion, Piers Gaveston, had been loathed by the nobility, who saw him as an arrogant upstart. They had captured and executed Gaveston in 1312, an act of open rebellion that left the king emotionally shattered and deeply resentful. In the years that followed, Edward was a man adrift, vulnerable and desperately searching for a new confidant, someone in whom he could place his absolute trust and affection. Into this emotional vacuum stepped Hugh Despenser. He possessed all the attributes that Edward found so alluring. He was handsome, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. But unlike the foreign-born Gaveston, Hugh was an Englishman with legitimate ties to the nobility, which made him a far more acceptable choice to the court, at least initially. Most importantly, he offered Edward something he craved above all else: an unwavering, seemingly fanatical loyalty. In 1318, Hugh's ascent was formalized when he was appointed royal chamberlain, a position that granted him unfettered access to the king's private chambers and personal life. This physical proximity was the key. It allowed him to forge a bond of unprecedented intimacy with the monarch, a relationship that soon blurred and then completely erased the lines between sovereign and subject, between friend and favorite. The whispers began almost immediately. At court and across the kingdom, chroniclers and gossips alike speculated on the true nature of the king's relationship with his new chamberlain, with many openly declaring them lovers. Hugh didn't just serve the king, he practically lived beside him, sleeping by the throne itself and becoming the sole gatekeeper to the monarch. From this privileged vantage point, he was poised to accumulate power on a scale that would make his predecessor, Gaveston, seem like a mere amateur. The foundation for his tyranny was laid, and the kingdom began to watch with a mixture of awe and growing dread. With the king's heart secured, Hugh Despencer and his father began to grasp the levers of the state, transforming their intimate influence into absolute control. They were no longer merely favorites, they became the de facto rulers of England, a shadow government operating from within the king's private chambers. All significant decisions of the realm, from matters of war and peace to the appointment of local sheriffs, had to first pass through the Despensers. Their word became law, and their enemies were branded enemies of the crown. To disagree with the Despencer policy was not merely political opposition, it was treated as an act of treason against King Edward himself, a dangerous conflation of personal favor with royal authority. So complete was their domination that the beleaguered English nobility resentfully nicknamed them the Second King and Third King of England, a bitter acknowledgement that the true monarch was little more than a puppet in their hands. Power, once secured, quickly curdled into unchecked arrogance and insatiable greed. Hugh, in particular, displayed a rapaciousness that shocked even the most cynical observers. He saw England not as a kingdom to be governed, but as a treasure chest to be plundered. With the king's authority as his personal weapon, he launched a campaign of legal and extra-legal extortion. He confiscated vast swathes of land from rival nobles, often based on completely fabricated accusations of disloyalty. Those who dared to stand in his way were summarily imprisoned without the pretense of a trial, their fortunes seized and their families ruined. His methods were brutal and effective, eliminating any potential threat to his supremacy while simultaneously enriching himself and his father to an obscene degree. He was building an empire of fear, alienating nobles who had once been sympathetic and sowing the seeds of a rebellion that was becoming increasingly inevitable. Yet, there was one person whose hatred for Hugh was not born of political grievance or lost land, but of a deep and personal wound. Queen Isabella, Edward's French wife, watched from the sidelines as Hugh Despencer systematically dismantled her life. He had not just become the king's chief advisor, he had usurped her role as the closest and most influential person in Edward's life, a position that was hers by right as his wife and queen. She was publicly and privately humiliated, her influence over her own husband completely nullified. Hugh controlled access to the king, he advised him on all matters, and he shared an intimacy with Edward that left her isolated and powerless. Hugh was the living embodiment of her husband's alienation and the symbol of her degradation as royal consort. Isabella was a proud woman, the daughter of a powerful French king, and she would neither forget nor forgive this profound humiliation. Her resentment simmered, a quiet, cold fury waiting for its moment to strike. That moment seemed to arrive in 1321. The English nobility, pushed to the breaking point by the Despencer's tyranny, finally erupted in open rebellion. Led by the powerful Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, a cousin to the king and one of the wealthiest men in the realm, a coalition of barons took up arms. Their demand was simple and non-negotiable: the immediate and permanent exile of Hugh Despencer and his father. King Edward, finding himself militarily outmaneuvered and politically isolated, with very little support among the aristocracy, was forced to capitulate. In a humiliating public ceremony, he agreed to banish his favorites from the kingdom. Hugh departed into exile, a bitter but temporary defeat. His time away from England was anything but a quiet period of reflection. Rather than accept his fate, Hugh revealed the depths of his audacity and resourcefulness. He took to the sea, becoming, for all intents and purposes, a pirate in the English Channel. He commanded a small fleet, attacking merchant vessels and plundering their cargo, continuing to accumulate wealth even in exile. More importantly, this was no mere act of banditry. He maintained a constant, secret line of communication with the lovelorn King Edward. Together, they meticulously plotted his return, planning a counterstrike that would not only restore him to power, but also annihilate the men who had dared to challenge him. By 1322, their plans were ready. King Edward, emboldened by Hugh's counsel, mustered his remaining loyal forces and set out to challenge the barons directly. In a series of brilliantly executed military campaigns that surprised his enemies, the king demonstrated a resolve and strategic skill he rarely showed. He crushed the aristocratic opposition. At the decisive Battle of Burbridge, the rebel army was shattered. Thomas of Lancaster was captured, subjected to a show trial, and brutally executed. With his chief nemesis dead, the king's victory was absolute. And with that victory, Hugh Despenser was triumphantly restored to his former position. Hugh's restoration inaugurated the darkest and most tyrannical period of Edward II's reign. With all his domestic enemies now dead or broken, there were no longer any checks on his power. He and his father exercised virtually unlimited authority. Entire castles and estates changed hands based on a single word from Hugh. Noble families who had stood against him were systematically destroyed, their lands forfeited, and their titles extinguished. England groaned under his iron-fisted rule. During this time, the bond between Hugh and King Edward reached its zenith of intimacy and toxicity. They were inseparable, with Hugh's control over the king translating into absolute control over the kingdom. He had won. He had vanquished all his rivals and stood alone at the pinnacle of power. But in his moment of total triumph, a new and far more dangerous threat was coalescing across the sea. Led by the one enemy he had fatally underestimated, the scorned and vengeful queen. The years following 1322 were the years of Despenser's absolute, terrifying power. England was held in a grip of fear, a kingdom where justice was a commodity and loyalty was enforced through intimidation. The bond between Hugh and King Edward had become a toxic fusion, isolating the monarch from his own realm and his own family. They were rarely seen apart, a constant, menacing presence at the heart of the court. Hugh's control was so complete that he governed the kingdom by governing the king, his personal whims shaping national policy. Yet, as he stood at the apex of his power, basking in the glow of the throne, he failed to see the storm gathering across the channel, a storm with his name at its heart. In 1325, Queen Isabella made the single most decisive move of her life. She secured permission to travel to France, her homeland, ostensibly on a diplomatic mission to negotiate a treaty with her brother, the French king. In reality, it was a brilliantly conceived escape. Once she was safely on French soil, she dropped the facade. She sent a clear and defiant message back to England. She would not return to her husband or her kingdom as long as Hugh Despenser remained at his side. This was a masterstroke of political theater. It painted her as the wronged wife and righteous queen, driven from her home by the malign influence of the hated favorite, and it put King Edward in an impossible position. In Paris, Isabella's quest for vengeance found its perfect partner. She formed a deadly and intimate alliance with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English nobleman who had his own reasons to despise the Despensers. Mortimer had been imprisoned by Edward and Hugh, and he had made a daring escape from the Tower of London, fleeing to France consumed with a desire for revenge. Together, Isabella and Mortimer became the nucleus of opposition to Edward's regime. Their shared hatred for Hugh blossomed into a political partnership and a passionate love affair. They began to plan what had once been unthinkable, an invasion of England with the express purpose of overthrowing King Edward II and, for Isabella, of ensuring Hugh Despenser suffered the most agonizing and humiliating death imaginable. She did not just want his head on a spike. She wanted his screams, his blood, and his utter degradation before the entire world. In September of 1326, the storm broke. Isabella and Mortimer landed on the English coast with a small force of around 1,500 mercenaries. A force of this size should have been easily crushed, But a shocking reality became immediately clear: no one would fight for the king. The years of tyranny had so thoroughly eroded Edward and Hugh's support that virtually the entire nobility, and the common people with them, refused to raise a finger in their defense. Instead, they flocked to Isabella's banner. The regime collapsed like a house of cards. A desperate King Edward and a panicked Hugh Despencer fled westward, clutching a significant portion of the royal treasury, hoping to find support in Wales. But there was no sanctuary to be found. Their few remaining followers deserted them daily, melting away until only a handful of loyal retainers were left. On November 16th, near Neath Abbey, the fugitives were finally cornered and captured, their desperate flight over. The day of reckoning, which Isabella had dreamed of for years, had finally arrived. The revenge began immediately. Hugh Despencer the Elder was captured and executed without delay in Bristol. Hugh the Younger was kept alive, his fate to be the centerpiece of a grand, horrific spectacle. Realizing that no mercy would be shown, Hugh attempted one last, desperate act of defiance. He refused all food and drink, hoping to starve himself to death before his enemies could enact their public vengeance. For nearly 2 weeks, he maintained a hunger strike, wasting away until he was little more than a specter of skin and bone. But Isabella was determined. She would not be cheated of her prize. And so we return to the central square of Hereford on November 24th, 1326. Thousands have gathered, their voices a thunderous roar of anticipation and hatred. A massive gallows, 50 feet high, dominates the square, a testament to the importance of the man about to die. On a specially constructed platform, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer sit as guests of honor, their eyes gleaming with cold, triumphant satisfaction. A trial is held, but it is a complete farce. Hugh, emaciated and weak, is accused of a long list of crimes: theft, treason, sodomy, some true, many fabricated. He is not permitted to speak in his own defense. The verdict was decided months ago in a Parisian court of two. The crowd bays for blood, and the execution that follows is designed to satisfy their every craving. First, Hugh is dragged to the gallows and partially hanged, choked until he is on the brink of death, but cut down while still alive and conscious. The executioner then moves in for the most terrible part of the ritual. Before the euphoric, cheering crowd, his genitals are sliced off and cast into a waiting fire. A specific punishment for what his enemies condemned as his unnatural relationship with the king. His agonized screams echo across the square, met only by roars of approval. He is then disemboweled, his entrails pulled out and burned before his living eyes. Through it all, Isabella watches with an icy calm, finally witnessing her hated rival receive what she considers his just deserts. At last, as his life finally fades, his head is severed, and his body is hacked into 4 pieces to be sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom. The execution of Hugh Despencer marked the end of an era. King Edward II was forced to abdicate and was later murdered in his prison cell at Berkeley Castle. Isabella and Mortimer ruled in the name of the young Edward III. But the wheel of fortune is ever turning. Only 4 years later, the young king, tired of being their puppet, staged his own coup. Roger Mortimer was captured and executed, a victim of the same brutal political game he had mastered. The story of Hugh Despencer remains a haunting and tragic chapter in English history, the tale of a man whose insatiable pursuit of power and intimacy with a king led him to unprecedented heights and resulted in his spectacular public destruction. His bloody end serves as one of history's most vivid reminders that in the deadly theater of politics, the price of absolute power is often absolute annihilation, before a roaring crowd that celebrates your fall.